Hello everybody and welcome to another whiskey comparison video. I'm Drew Hanish and we're going to jump into two historic brands, two that are sometimes hard to find. Some people are a little worried that one of these is going to be a lot harder to find because of a recent acquisition by a particular distillery. Going to get into all that, a little bit of the history, and talk about some pop culture around one of these whiskeys as well. The whiskeys are Early Times, bottled in bond, and also the JTS Brown, bottled in bond. Now, both of these have very, very interesting histories, and if we talk about Early Times, then we're talking about the Beam family, because the Beam family is who started this. It was actually Uncle Jack. Jim Beam's Uncle Jack is the one that started Early Times in the was it 1860? 1860. If you look at the label, it actually says established in 1860. And one of the employees that worked there was Minor Case Beam, who ended up going off and starting his own distillery, which sooner or later ended up producing Yellowstone. So we talked about that in a previous episode. What happened to Early Times, though? It actually wasn't a very popular whiskey under the Beams. It wasn't until it was actually, let's see, in 1915, Jack died, his son Ed died, and the product just kind of floundered. It was in the warehouse, but Prohibition came up, and all of a sudden now there's this Early Times just sitting there waiting in a warehouse for somebody to do something with it. And along comes Brown-Forman, and Brown-Forman decided to purchase all those stocks and start selling it under their medicinal license during Prohibition. And the result of that was that coming out of Prohibition, Early Times had established its name and became a very popular whiskey out of the 1940s and 1950s. So it has a very interesting history behind it. It was long about 1983 that they decided to start cheapening the product and got it into this, which is, if you buy this overseas, it actually says Kentucky bourbon, and they don't put in the diluted whiskey. I call it diluted whiskey, but it's actually just whiskey that's been aged differently because of the used barrels. It was all in an effort to save money, and so that's how things rolled for quite a long time, until about mid last decade when they decided to come out with this bottled in bond version. And there was a nice bit of demand in the places where you could actually buy it, and so it is hung around on the shelf until Sazerac has come in now and purchased Early Times from Brown-Forman. And what that's done is it's caused this uproar through the community that everybody needs to go out and buy as many bottles of Early Times as they can get right now, not because they're afraid that Sazerac is going to change the formula, which they may, but more because if you think about Sazerac products like Buffalo Trace, E.H. Taylor, Pappy Van Winkle, or Eagle Rare, they're always on allocation. Every time you go to a store, you have to get there on the day that they show up. Otherwise, you're not going to get a bottle. So people are freaking out that Early Times is not going to be available. But I have a theory about that. And my theory is that Sazerac puts items on allocation that are their mid to upper shelf products. Their bottom shelf products, I can find Old Charter just about anywhere. It's inexpensive. I've never heard of anybody having a problem finding it. Benchmark, any of those, they always seem to have plentiful supply of. So people may be freaking out for no reason. Then again, who knows? Because as someone pointed out, this may not actually be bottom shelf anymore. So I'm going to do a tasting here in just a moment, and we'll talk a little bit about that. So the mash bill on both of these whiskeys, very similar. They both have around, well, this has 12% malt, this has 10% malt. This has, let's see, JTS Brown is 10% rye, this is 11% rye, otherwise the rest is corn. So very, very similar in terms of their mash bills, but they taste very different from each other. Price wise, there's a decent price difference between these two. You can get a liter of this for around $15 and a liter of this for around 25. Although I have a feeling if demand starts really cranking up on it, you may see that price start to elevate the way that, Heaven Hill products usually tend to elevate that way. So anyway, that's kind of the story behind Early Times and the current state of the product. If you can find it in your area, it is worth checking out. I personally, I still think it probably is a bottom shelf product, but it's a good bottom shelf. It goes with those really, quality bottom shelf products. Mm. You'll notice, wow, you won't notice and talk much about the nose on this one. It has a nose. There's a little oak, a little caramel in there, but you really got to draw on it to try to get any kind of nose out of it. The flavor on this one is sweet. I mean, it is sweet. I think this is a good entry whiskey for people who probably are, they don't want any of that overly harsh spice from a rye or burn from the corn. This one is very interesting because almost like there's a wine kind of a fruity wine kind of thing that goes on. And then there's a vanilla in there, but there's a little pepper bite to it. It's spicy, but it's not aggressive. So from that standpoint, very good. But it's the finish that's really interesting on this whiskey because I get red jelly beans out of this. I get a little candy corn out of this. I get a hint of that black pepper is still there. And then I even get a little espresso and then a little bit of that fruitiness also in there. So very interesting whiskey. And it's probably not as refined. And this is why I say I don't feel like this has really graduated to that middle shelf yet. It feels like it's getting up there, but it's a really nice value whiskey as long as you can find it around 25 bucks a liter, and they only sell it in liters, so that's why I say in a liter size. There's a little oak and nuttiness on the nose on that one. You're going to want to drink the Early Times first, though, if you drink these two together, because yesterday I drank the JTS Brown first and came back to this, and all I could taste was JTS Brown, no matter what I did with this one. So, all right, let's talk about JTS Brown just a little bit. Now, this is a whiskey that I first learned about through the movie The Hustler, which, if you've ever seen that, there's a point where the pool shark by the name of Fast Eddie Felson, who's played by Paul Newman, orders up a bottle of JTS Brown with no ice, no glass. So while he's sitting there playing. So I don't know how you shoot pool and drink an entire bottle of whiskey, but apparently it's Hollywood. Maybe it improves your. My game's so bad that it couldn't hurt it at all. So that's kind of the pop culture side of JTS Brown. What's interesting, this is made by Heaven Hill. It's definitely one of their bottom shelf whiskeys. And I've only seen it, I only saw it in Kentucky for the longest time, but now it's more widely available. It comes in a 100 proof, and it also comes in I think it comes in an 80 proof also. I don't know that I would touch the 80 proof. This is substantial in flavor, but it feels like it could disappear really quickly. Behind the name JTS Brown, by the way, JTS Brown is another historic brand. It goes all the way back. That last name Brown should sound familiar because JTS Brown was actually the half brother of George Garvin Brown, who started the distilleries, or started the whiskey rectifying business that brought us Old Forester and now owns Jack Daniels and actually owned Early Times up until recently. So very interesting on that. It's actually JTS Brown Jr., who, and I think that's JTS Brown is the main picture, and then Jr. is probably on one of these sides. JTS Brown Jr. is the one who was involved in setting up the Old Prentice distillery in 1910. And if you're not familiar with Old Prentice, the Old Prentice distillery, some of you may have already been to it and didn't even know that it was the Old Prentice distillery. It was built in 1910. It was built with a Spanish mission architecture. It was very popular in Southern California, and they built this whole distillery in Kentucky. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. If all of that doesn't sound familiar to you, then you've obviously never been to the Four Roses distillery, because Four Roses is now in the distillery that was established by JTS Brown that was called Old Prentice. So there you go. Got your history in on JTS Brown. Now this one has actually a weaker nose on it than the Early Times does. I had to cap it, and even after capping it, I really couldn't get much else out of it. So in for a taste. There's some sweetness there. There's a toffee. There's a little bit of pepperiness. But every time I drink this, there's one thing I always pull out of it, and that is black licorice. If you like black licorice, and I know it's one of those things you either love it or you don't, there's a lot of black licorice, and it lingers on through the finish on this one. It's towards the end of this that you start to lose that refined character. There's no real refined character on the nose because there's not much of a nose. It has a decent mouthfeel to it. It's a little watery, but it's still a decent whiskey on that end. It's nutty, but and you get that toffee and you get that black licorice, but then you get the char on the finish. You really start to taste the barrel char towards the end. I said burnt toast the first time that I tasted it. It just kind of had that. There's a little caramel in there also, but for the most part, I think it's a really good value bourbon. Again, if you're looking for something that's going to be $15 for a bottle, or $12, I guess is what I paid for the 750 ml. I think you can't go wrong with it. It's just, when I went into this, I thought I was going to be pulling for JTS Brown because it's been in my house for a while, and it's one of those that I go, when I go to Kentucky, I got to get myself another bottle of JTS Brown. But between these two, I think I edge in, even though if I'm in the black licorice mood, this is the way I'm going. I think overall, I'm going to go with the Early Times. And you guys did too, actually overwhelmingly went for Early Times, 88% to 12%. So that's my tasting. Hope you enjoyed the little bit of history and pop culture thrown in there as well. And good to get over to this side of the Atlantic again. I'll have another tasting coming up probably in about a week and a half. I'm going to do some traveling. So I may have some traveling videos for you guys coming up in the near future. But let me know what you guys think of the tasting, which ones of these you've liked, not liked, why you've liked them, why you didn't like them, all that fun stuff. I'd love to hear your feedback. And until next time, cheers.